right? Other issues have come to the forefront in recent times as well, such as theonomy and biblical patriarchy, and postmillennialism and Christian nationalism, radical two kingdoms theory, and Christian reconstructionism, to name a few, right? Now, we have to note that none of these are actually new issues. The conversation surrounding a few of them, at least, has been going on for a few decades now, right? However, similar to the issue concerning government lockdowns, right, they now come to the forefront of people's minds and have an elevated urgency because of the circumstances of our times. Now, people are, talking about theonomy and Christian nationalism and Christian reconstructionism because they're looking for, they're looking around at our crumbling Western societies and they're seeking biblical answers as to how to set things right again, right? And as the pillars of the former Christendom are being eroded and knocked out, the structure of the free societies that it was built, it built, is actually starting to crumble and collapse. These conversations, therefore, about theonomy and Christian nationalism and reconstructionism they all have this in common. The fact that they're different systems wrestling with the question of how does the Bible equip us to think rightly about rightly ordering society and its civil government and laws, right? And it's an important conversation for Christians to have, and it has to happen if we would have any hope for the future of Western civilization, right? Each position takes a slightly different approach, but they all are looking to God's word to try to make a compelling argument. And, it often comes down to a matter of hermeneutics and presuppositions. As such, they can often be complicated matters to navigate, right? Yet, astonishingly, we have a lot of Christians, particularly young men in particular, right, who are now interested in actually having these debates. Although, sometimes that happens with more heat than light, right? And, I think that this should encourage pastors to see such an appetite for understanding and applying God's word to an area of practical living. Yet sadly, some have not responded favorably and instead sought to shut down the conversation or frame it as divisive, right? Which I admit it can be, right? It does not necessarily have to be, though, right? Some pastors are also caught unprepared, right, to have the conversation even in the first place. And so they avoid it. Now, in terms of our topic here, how do we then rightly categorize these issues? Should they be primary, secondary, or tertiary? Then, we have the somewhat related issue of postmillennialism and eschatology, right? So broadly speaking, and there is a lot of controversy to this statement, I know, okay? So just prefacing it. Eschatological systems can be divided up into optimistic and pessimistic views of the unfolding of history leading up to the end. I've sometimes, jokingly called it pessimillennialism versus optimillennialism, right? Now, notice that I said that they focus on the unfolding of history, meaning how life in the here and now, before the eternal state, right, the eschaton, has been consummated, right? And this is because all orthodox eschatological positions could be considered optimistic about the ultimate victory of Christ in the end, right? Christ will ultimately win. And that's not where the debate is, right? Every Orthodox Christian should believe that Christ ultimately wins. Instead, the issue is on what does the lead up to that ultimate victory look like, right? Is it focused on whether or not we can rightly hope for things to get better in the long run here in Earth's history, or expect that it will instead eventually lead to a great decline before Christ's glorious return? Now, this was also another issue that many would have firmly put into tertiary doctrine category, right? I think just traditionally, eschatology has kind of been parked in that sort of a category, right? And many used to think that eschatology has very little practical implications for their faith and practice. So why divide over it, right? However, in recent events, I think it's exposed just how closely tied one's eschatological position is to other areas of life and ministry, such as the importance of public engagement on social issues. Right? And this has led many to rethink this categorization. For example, some are more on the radical side of pessimistic eschatologies, they would actually discourage people from engaging in social issues, since there's no use polishing brass on a sinking ship, right? If history is fated to get worse and worse until Christ's return, then the Christian's role is basically to hunker down and try to save as many souls as they can before the whole thing falls apart, right? And similarly, advocates of the R2K sort of theology, so radical two kingdoms theology, would argue for this dualistic separation of sacred and secular spheres, and never shall the two meet, right? Nor should they. And these are logical implications of a person's eschatology, right? These positions will significantly affect a church's emphasis in ministry and whether or not they exhort and equip their people towards public engagement on cultural and political issues. So then, is eschatology to be actually considered a tertiary doctrine, or should we actually consider it a secondary doctrine? I think there's some gray area there now, right? That perhaps there's more importance to it than we previously assigned it, right? And then there's the issue of complementarianism and biblical patriarchy, right? This issue can seem a little bit out of place here, but it's connected, as all of theology really is, because the Christian worldview is actually an all-encompassing, intricately linked, comprehensive, and total view of every area of life. It used to be that the only questions that evangelicals were asking is your church complementarian? Do they ordain female pastors? And then, came the radical feminists and the LGBTQ movement. Now, everything is about gender and sexuality. Everything is being questioned and under attack, actually, from the culture, causing, many people today to rethink the basis for their understanding of gender and sex, and also having to wrestle with real-world implications of their beliefs in, for example, their job places, right, their workplaces and schools, as they undergo, maybe mandatory DEI training or pride celebrations. And as our culture moves more and more towards androgyny, all of a sudden, the distinctions between sexes and understanding of gender became much more intense and having practical implications on people's lives. So again, as with the prior issues, Christians began to more intensely struggle for a coherent, systematic biblical answer to the questions that they were facing. And as you go down that bunny trail long enough, you realize that it has implications to your whole theology of gender roles and design. Now, because of the confusion over gender and sexuality in our culture, it matters more urgently to many evangelicals that a church is not just complementarian in affirming the Bible's gender roles in the church and family, but also that it be consistently complementarian, seeing that these roles are inextricably linked to our created nature and design as male and females. So, that is, we take our maleness and our femaleness wherever we go, so that, it must therefore have some implications for other spheres of life outside just the church and the family.